Hello, my name is Shannon Allen. I'm a doctoral student at Liberty University studying general psychology. My research interests are trauma, crisis, and violence. Today I'm going to discuss elements of my proposed research on potential links between the monoamine oxidase A gene and the dark triad personality traits. During the following presentation, I will discuss the research problem, the variables under investigation and how they will be operationalized, empirically evidenced conceptual contexts, the research design, the hypothesis, participant and sample characteristics, materials and apparatus I will use, and the procedure. This study aims to determine if there is a relationship between the monoamine oxidase A or MAOA gene and the dark triad personality traits. Neurocriminologists have identified connections between criminally violent behaviors and low MAOA or MAOAL gene activity. MAOAL individuals tend to be hypersensitive to adverse experiences and act out violently when provoked. Likewise, the dark triad, which is Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, underlie many criminally violent behaviors. Both the MAOA gene and the dark triad have been linked to criminal violence. However, no research to date has examined a potential association between the MAOAL genotype and the dark triad traits. This study will extend the scholarship of criminally violent behaviors from both a trait and genetic-based perspective. The predictor variable for this study will be operationally defined by MAOA enzyme levels as determined by the next generation sequencing test. The comparison group will include MAOA typical or MAOAT participants. The quasi-experimental group will include MAOAL participants. The criterion variables that will be measured include the dark triad, which again is Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. The dark triad will be operationalized by participant scores on the short dark triad questionnaire. Over the last 2 decades, research has linked genetic factors to violent behavior. The most robust genetic implication is the MAOA gene. Deficiencies in the MAOA enzyme have been associated with antisocial, aggressive, and violent behaviors, especially in white males. 2 studies found significant associations between criminally violent inmates and MAOAL genotypes. In their study with 89 male prisoners, Stetler and colleagues found that the NAOAL genotype was a prominent risk factor for criminal violence regardless of other psychological factors. The sample for this study included 49 Caucasian and Black violent imprisoned inmates convicted of first or second degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, rape, domestic and non-domestic battery, and indecent liberties with minors. The control sample consisted of 40 Caucasian and Black nonviolent inmates convicted of theft, robbery, and burglary, drug possession, sale, and theft, forgery, and DUI manslaughter. Stetler and colleagues age-matched violent and nonviolent groups. A psychological analysis revealed no instances of diagnostic antisocial personality disorder or schizophrenia. The predictive variable for this study was a violent and nonviolent offender designation. The criterion variable for this study was the number of MAOA allele repeats, with 2 to 3 repeats designated as MAOAL and 4 designated as MAOA high, and high scores on the Barrett Impulsivity Scale and the Bus-Perry Aggression Questionnaire. Childhood trauma, as determined by the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire, was a control variable. Inmates with the MAOAL genotype accounted for 61.22% of violent inmates and only 20% of nonviolent offenders. In a similar study with 554 male and female extremely violent, and nonviolent Finnish offenders, Tahonen and colleagues determined that the lower the MAOA enzyme function, the more violent the offender, regardless of childhood maltreatment. The sample for this study consisted of 124 males and 12 female nonviolent offenders with a mean age of 37.3, 339 male and 21 female violent offenders with a mean age of 37.4, and 56 male and 2 female extremely violent offenders with a mean age of 36.7. The predictive variables for this study were nonviolent, violent, and extremely violent designations. Violent offenders were defined as murder, attempted murder, manslaughter, attempted manslaughter, homicide, and battery. Nonviolent crimes were defined as drug, property, and drunk driving crimes. Violent offending was operationalized as at least one violent offense. Extreme violent offending was defined as 10 or more violent offenses. Their criteria variable was the number of MAOA allele repeats, with 2 to 3 repeats designated as MAOAL and 4 designated as MAOA high. Childhood maltreatment was the control variable measured by a retrospective self-report questionnaire specifically designated for the study. The MAOAL genotype was associated with violent offending regardless of sex and childhood maltreatment. The MAOAL association was more robust among extremely violent offenders than violent offenders. No association was found among nonviolent offenders. The dark triad personality traits are also associated with violent behavior. While Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy are distinct traits, they significantly intercorrelate to create increased aggression. All three traits are associated with low self-control, conscientiousness, and agreeableness, callousness, manipulation, superficiality, and antisocial behaviors, which are all cited as violence predictors. Jones and Figueroa took a closer look at the overlapping characteristics of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy that implicate the dark triad as a predictive construct for aggression and violence. The sample for this study involved 397 university students who were already involved in research on antagonistic behaviors and personality traits. Women accounted for 75% of the sample. The mean age for all participants was 21. The variables for this study were psychopathy, as operationalized by scores on the self-report psychopathy scale that measured the characteristics interpersonal manipulation, callous affect, erratic lifestyle, and antisocial behavior. Narcissism was operationalized by scores on the Narcissistic Personality Inventory and evaluated the characteristics of entitlement, leadership, and grandiosity. Machiavellianism was operationalized by scores on the Mach 4 questionnaire, which examined the characteristics of manipulative tactics and a cynical worldview. Researchers found that manipulation and callousness emerged as the overlapping characteristics of the dark triad traits most likely to result in aggressive or violent behaviors. These characteristics were deemed the darkest variables. Two studies specifically looked at the dark triad and violent crime. For example, Paling and colleagues determined that all three traits were associated with violence. Their study consisted of 116 females and 43 males from the general population with a mean age of 29.25. A forensic history questionnaire revealed 10 males and 8 females interacted with law enforcement regarding warnings or convictions. The predictive variable for this study was the dark triad operationalized by scores on the SD3 questionnaire. The criterion variable was self-reported violence operationalized by scores from the MacArthur Community Violence Screening Instrument. Of the dark traits, psychopathy was the strongest predictor of self-reported violence, followed by Machiavellianism and narcissism. Wright and colleagues examined the dark triad as a single construct. They sought to determine how the dark triad was related to delinquency. The sample for their study consisted of 50 males and 50 females from 8 schools situated in a large Saudi Arabian city. Students were 10th to 12th graders. The independent variable for this study was the dark triad, as operationalized by scores on the Dirty Dozen questionnaire. The dependent variables for this study were all delinquency, violent delinquency, and drug delinquency, as operationalized by scores on the National Youth Survey. They found that the dark triad personality was significantly predictive of violent delinquency. This study will employ a between groups quasi-experimental design to explore the relationship between variations of the MAOA gene and dark triad personality traits. It is predicted that criminally violent inmates with the MAOAL allele will score higher on the SD3 assessment than criminally violent inmates with the MAOAT allele. Participants will be recruited via flyers and posters from the all-male Red Onion State Prison, Keene Mountain Correctional Facility, and Wallens Ridge State Prison. Interested inmates may contact the prison psychologist. To be considered for the study, inmates must be male, violent offenders who have not had a psychosis diagnosis and must not test positive for the MAOA5 variant. Violent offenses are defined as murder, attempted murder, battery, and rape. Exclusion will not be determined by age, ethnicity, race, level of education, socioeconomic status, or geographic location. However, a sample representative of the general prison population convicted of violent crimes would be approximately 36% Black, 36% Hispanic, and 28% white, 65% age 55 or older, and 32% who obtained a GED, 22.3% who had some high school, 20.1% who graduated from high school, 14.8% who completed the 8th grade or less, 8.6% who had some college, and 2.2% who graduated college. And a priori power analysis was conducted using G-Power version 3196 to identify the minimal sample size necessary to test the research hypothesis. In order to detect a medium effect size of Cohen's d equals 0.5 with 80% power, the needed sample size is 51 participants per group in an independent samples t-test. The smallest effect size was set to d equals 0.5 based on research conducted by Lakens. Therefore, based on the G-power analysis, the goal is to have a sample size of n is greater than or equal to 102 to test the study's hypothesis with a 95% confidence level. An equal assignment to the MAOAL and MAOAT groups would be ideal. The Washington Early Recognition Center Affectivity and Psychosis Screen is a 16-item self-report questionnaire that calculates symptom severity by considering frequency of occurrence and impaired functioning. Questions 1 through 8 investigate mood dysregulation, whereas 9 through 16 investigate psychotic episodes. For the purpose of participant exclusion, only the psychosis screen will be used for this study. Total scores are calculated by adding the frequency of Likert scale scores. The psychosis scale has a maximum score of 64, with a score of greater than or equal to 30 suggestive of a psychotic disorder. The psychosis screen has good internal consistency with an alpha of 0.92 and retest reliability with R equals 0.86. Participant DNA will be analyzed for MOAO levels by Virginia Tech's Genomics Sequencing Center at the Fralin Life Sciences Institute. MAOA deficiencies are determined by allele frequency. Allele frequencies can be 2, 3, 3.54, or 5. Frequencies of 3.5 and 4 are known to have MAOAH enzyme activity and are classified as typical. A frequency of 2 or 3 is classified as low. Individuals who test for frequency 5 will be excluded from the study as little is known about the enzyme activity for these categories. Next generation sequencing will be used. NGS can detect repeats of the MAOA allele with greater than 99% sensitivity. Saliva will be collected from participants using the DNA Genotech OmniGene Oral Swab Kit, item number OME505. An ad hoc demographic questionnaire will be created to capture participant characteristics. The questionnaire will inquire about age, race, and school level completed. In addition, information about the specific type of violent crimes, age of crime, victims, sentence length, and other crimes will be collected. The dark triad personality traits will be examined using the short dark triad instrument. The SD3 is a 27-item, 9-item per trait self-report questionnaire that evaluates different facets of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Scores are captured using a 5-point Likert scale. Mean scores outside the normal range were greater than 3.86 for Machiavellianism, 3.68 for narcissism, and 3.4 for psychopathy. The reliability of the SD3 is 0.849. Internal consistency is good with an alpha of 0.80. Violent offender status will be verified by the prison psychologist for inmates interested in participating in the study. Multiple sessions will be conducted at each participating prison. During the first session, researchers will explain the study. Consent will be obtained, and participants will be screened for psychosis using the WorCat. In addition, the first session will include the demographic questionnaire, and saliva samples will be collected for the MAOA analysis. Genotyping results will take up to 3 weeks to be returned. Participants with allele repeats of 5 will receive exclusion letters. Patients who screen positive for psychosis will also receive a letter explaining their exclusion from the study. During the second session, the remaining participants will complete the SD3. There are roughly 1 million violent crimes committed each year in the United States, with approximately 45 homicides each day. Violence has profound health, societal, and economic ramifications. In addition to victims' loss of life, pain, and suffering, individuals living in areas where violent crimes are higher report poor mental and physical health than those living in safer neighborhoods. The economic impact of violent crime is also substantial, costing taxpayers nearly $500 billion each year. Psychological and biological factors play a complex and interconnected role in the commission of violent crimes. By understanding these roles, we can devise more effective methods of reducing violence in our society.